Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second annual Nate Geller Memorial Lecture. Um, Before jumping into the program itself, I just want to say a few words about Nate of blessed memory. Nate was a beloved member of the 70 Faces media team. He passed away at the beginning of 2022. We're going to put a link to the obituary tribute that we had on JTA, so you can read more about him. I just want to say a few words. One thing that's really struck me as we put this lecture together for this year is that, of course, the events of October 7th and the fallout and the instances of anti-Semitism in America, would all have been tremendously devastating to Nate. But I think what's probably most important looking forward is what I think Nate's other set of reactions would have been. I think he's somebody who would have, and I think his career and his passions testify to this, would have responded even in the depths of the tragedy and his own sadness, immense sadness over what happened, would also be looking to the future, be looking for ways to make a difference in his own synagogue community, 70 Faces Media. I think he'd be thinking about, the devastation and what needs to happen with recovery in Israel, coexistence between segments of the Israeli population, how to provide young Jewish students with opportunities to strengthen their identities, to connect. And I think he'd, bring a level of a determined optimism, hope combined with action to really help rebuild and move forward. And I also want to just say thank you to Nate's widow, Lynn, and the rest of the family for allowing us the honor to have this this annual lecture and to be joining us today. I'm gonna introduce our main speaker, Gil Troy, who's gonna talk. He'll be giving a lecture and a presentation, and then when he's done, Philissa Cramer, JTA's editor-in-chief, will join and handle the Q&A with some of our own questions, but also questions from all of you in the audience. You can put your questions in the chat, select Philissa in the chat, and the questions will go to her. Let me introduce Gil. Gil Troy is a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University and currently lives in Jerusalem. He is an award-winning American presidential historian and a leading Zionist activist. He is most recently the editor of the new 3-volume set, Theodor Herzl, Zionist Writings. Gil, thank you so much for doing this.
I'm honored to be here. Actually, when I was asked to give this lecture, it was a particular honor because I had the privilege of working with Nate and Lynn back in Camp Tel Yehuda, the Young Judea camp in the 1980s. And two things in particular, I remember. One is just Nate's wisdom and his menschlichkeit. And Tel Yehuda, like all summer camps, is insane. And there's a lot of emotion and a lot of big personalities and a lot of passion. And Nate had this ability to get past that and to understand who we were and to calm things down. And he was a very effective leader in that way. And Lynn, you were this crazy person who had this idea that every camp needs a social worker. And you were wrong. These days, people need a social work staff. So you were really so ahead of the curve. And it's really an honor to be in conversation with you. Some of you who know me well may notice that I have a beard. It's because I lost my father just a week and a half ago, and is one of my first acts after Shiva, and I'm honored that the timing worked out well. But it's also very fitting because in many ways, Nate and my father would have loved one another. They were educators, they were activists, they were Jewish community leaders. And when I think about my father's legacy, and here I'm hoping that we can get into the slideshow. Sec. There we go. Right, people can see it. Two things in particular about my father are, one, that he was a Lower East Side street rat. And I know we have at least one former chanich of his, one former student of his from Camp Beitar. And in 1944, he hears about Camp Beitar, and he hears about Jabotinsky, and he hears about the vision of Zionism at a time when American Jews are humiliated because all these superstars, all these superheroes are coming back from the war, because by 1944, America has successfully fought back against the Nazis and against the Japanese. And to be in the Lower East Side at that point must have been a low point as an American Jew, because you're already hearing about the humiliation, about the murders, about the powerlessness of the Jew. And this vision, not just of Jabotinsky from the right, but also of Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir from the left, this vision of Zionism, this vision of being able to take history by its horns, of not being defined by the anti-Semite. The anti-Semite doesn't make the Jew, even though Jean-Paul Sartre would write that shortly after World War II. The Jew makes the Jew. And when you see this picture of my father, you see, I think, one of the central ideals of his life and also of Nate's life, which is that ideas count. And we're seeing it today on the university campuses. We're seeing that the idea of Zionism can raise people up and have them defend themselves. We're also seeing how anti-Zionism can lead people to do the most unspeakable things: bullying, disrespecting their own classmates, and think it's justified. So it's all a matter of how we use it. And that menschlichkeit that I mentioned of Nate's is so important. The other thing is that when I think about the beautiful relationship that I witnessed between Nate and Lynn, is that values count, and that people talk about marriages being made in heaven, but I think they're also made in common values, and they're made in common cause. And they're also made by understanding that we Jews are lucky enough not only to be living in 2024 with all its challenges, but we're also not just living on American time, we're also living in Jewish time. And if you look at my parents, at the Hebrew of my parents' invitation, they defined their wedding invitation and their marriage and their family by saying they were married in 1955 in the 6th year of Medinat Yisrael, the 6th year of the State of Israel. And given that this lecture is coming the day after Yom Ha'atzmaut, a difficult Yom Ha'atzmaut, a painful Yom Ha'atzmaut, but nevertheless an important Yom Ha'atzmaut, where I felt it was more important than ever to celebrate, more important than ever to acknowledge the miracle, more important than ever to see how lucky we are even with all these challenges, is exactly what the lecture is about today, because today is about the possibilities of Zionism now. And we know how painful October 7th was. We know how problematic that world was. We know the images that are so painful. And it's true, on that day, Israel failed. The government failed. The IDF failed. But I disagree with my good friend and last year's lecturer, Dan Gordis, who suggested in one of his very important podcasts, which is worth watching, that October 7th suggests that Zionism failed too. Because Zionism never promised us a rose garden. Zionism never promised us that the state would be given, what was the poem, Al Magasha Kesef, on a silver platter, which was a phrase that Chaim Weizmann said states aren't given on a silver platter, that Natan Alterman also turned into a classic poem. Zionism couldn't ultimately solve the problem of anti-Semitism because, as my father saw in 1944, as Nate understood, Zionism is about Jewish empowerment and a Jewish story. Anti-Zionism, anti-Judaism, Jew hatred is the problem, as I said, of the non-Jew, not the Jew. And I actually think we spend far too much time. And when I look at Nate's career and I look at how much he invested in things like 70 Faces and the Soviet Jewish movement and Tel Yehuda and his temple, which were all about Jewish identity building, about affirming Judaism, not just fighting our haters. He understood that the true identity that we have to build is not anti-Semitism, not anti-Zionism, but something positive. And that's the process I had to go through on October 7th and the days after. My wife, 4 kids, and I, 17 years ago, went on sabbatical to Jerusalem, and we're still here. It's turned into the world's longest sabbatical. And it's the hardest thing we ever did, the craziest thing we ever did, but in many ways also the most wonderful thing we ever did. If we go back to October 6th, the fundamental tension in the Troy family was that our first kid to get married, Yoni, had gotten engaged in June. And I'm sure those of you who have gotten married recently or have kids or grandkids have gotten married recently know that there's this wedding mania that overtakes. And we're entering into the Chag, entering into the holiday. And what's the central tension in the Troy family? Can we spend 25 hours together? Because blessedly, we only have 1 day rather than 2 days of holiday. And avoid talking about the wedding. Because in fact, Yoni is in Tel Aviv that day with his fiancée, now wife. And nevertheless, we know that the question of who's coming, who's not coming, who's wearing what dress, what suit do I have to wear is going to come up. And of course, we miss those tensions. We miss having lived in La La Land. And I don't have to tell you the story of what happened on October 7th. I don't have to tell you the pain, the suffering, the loss. But within minutes, Yoni, who was in Tel Aviv, was scrambling up north. And one of the miracles of the day is, as in October 1973, because the streets were empty, the soldiers got up north quickly enough so that Hezbollah didn't invade. First miracle. And we didn't have a pincer movement. You can only imagine how much more painful it would have been, how much more we would have suffered, how many more people would have been killed and maimed and raped and kidnapped. My other son, Aviv, who had just finished serving as a Duvdevan commando and was in Sri Lanka, hears in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, Sri Lanka, in the Chabad, Yerushalayim Bo'eret, Jerusalem is burning. And he runs back to his hotel, turns on his WhatsApp, and follows through the Duvdevan Commando WhatsApp of alumni this battle and that battle, as they're trading information, as they're using, because the command and control systems had failed, as they're using their own WhatsApp group to dispatch one another to fight here, to fight there. He flies home late Sunday night. Remarkable, by the way, and I've had the privilege of hosting so many of you from the United States over the last couple of months. And the question I always say is, haven't you heard there's a war on? You're crazy. How is it that Jews run toward us? And how is it that 200,000 Israelis ran home? And so many of them, like Aviv, came back and quickly by the next morning were on their way to base. That's the kind of crazy we need, because it's a crazy that comes from love. It's a crazy that comes from commitment. It's a crazy, I'd like to argue, that comes from Zionism and that reflects the possibilities of Zionism. So we pick up Aviv early Sunday morning and we're asking him, where's this friend? Oh, he just flew back from Thailand. Where's that friend? Oh, he is in the middle of flying from New Zealand to Tahiti to Los Angeles to get to Israel, because that's the only ticket he got. And when I saw this young friend, Oren, a few weeks later, I said, Oren, didn't you go to high school with my son Aviv? He goes, yeah. I said, well, didn't you learn geography? But of course, he was going to move heaven and earth. He was going to crisscross the world to get home. Unfortunately, as we enter Jerusalem, about 30 minutes into the ride, Aviv says, but I have to tell you, our friend Ben is missing. Ben Mizrahi, born in Vancouver, had come to Israel on an Israel program, but he didn't want to be on kind of a curated American or Canadian program. He wanted to be on a program with real Israeli kids. And he ended up with Aviv and others, and he became Keben Bayit, as we say, one of the family, somebody we truly, truly loved. And we subsequently discovered there were 7 other families that thought of him as Keben Bayit, because he was one of those kids who just walked into your home and walked straight into your heart. He had a great love of life, and he decided to stay in Israel. He decided to become a combat medic. He did the all-important trip to South America and returned to Israel. And on October 7th was at the rave, was at the party. And on Monday morning, when I drive Aviv to base, Aviv says something awful. Aviv's 23 years old. He says, I hope they kill Ben, because I can't imagine him kidnapped. I can't imagine him in their hands. Think of this division. Think of these choices. Think of these dilemmas we've had to struggle with since October 7th. By Tuesday, we discovered that Ben had been found. And on Wednesday, when we got to the funeral, the first thing we heard was that Ben hadn't been killed by some shots from above. His body hadn't been desecrated, but that Ben and a friend of Aviv's, Itai, who was a commando, had sprung into action. And the last picture we have of Ben is of having stolen a medical pack from an ambulance. And he and Itai were scrambling. They also stole a golf cart. They didn't learn that in Vancouver. And they were maneuvering people back and forth to the medical tent, because who can imagine the scale of the catastrophe? And then Bennett made it here to this to a police van, and unfortunately was killed in a hail of bullets. When I heard that at Ben's funeral on Wednesday, I flipped a switch. And it's the switch we all have to flip. And it's the argument I want to make today. Until that moment, Shabbat, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, as the body count increased, as the hostage count increased, as we heard about unspeakable things imposed on young and old alike, we were stuck in Holocaust. We were stuck in pogrom. We were stuck in failure. We were stuck in powerlessness. We were stuck in the 1944 Gil Troy experience. We were stuck in the world that so many of our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were born into. But when I heard Ben's story and Itai's story, and by then I was hearing more and more stories, I flipped back into Zionism. Because Zionism gave us the tools to react, to fight back when necessary, and dream always. So yes, Israel as a government failed on October 7th. The Israeli Defense Forces failed on October 7th. But the miracle, what I call October 7.2, is that Zionism succeeded. Zionism raised a citizenry ready to fight back. Zionism raised a citizenry with the skills and the weapons often at their hands to fight back. And on October 7.2, Israelis saved Israel thanks to Zionism. Thanks to the Zionism that Nate and Lynn and I talked about and celebrated in the 1980s at Camp Tel Yehuda. Thanks to the Zionism that inspired Ben Mizrahi and his friend Itai to fight back. I call this the jujitsu. You take the negative and turn it into a positive. And let's go broader, outside of Israel. If we were sitting around here on October 5th, and the lecture had been then, and we were talking about Jewish identity in the modern world, we all would have bemoaned the fact that most young Jews, especially on campus today, don't really have deep feelings of peoplehood, don't really have strong identities. But we would have said, wow, if you want to look at a model of people who really do have a strong identity, perhaps we can learn something from them. We'd say, look at the feminists. Feminists on campus, on this laboratory, ideological laboratory, sociological laboratory called the North American campus. Feminists have a strong sense of identity, especially in the last 10, 15 years. Me too. Silence is violence. Zero tolerance for gendered violence. Wow, there's something we could learn from them. And on October 7th, what happened? As they scrolled, I've now caught up. It's not just, you don't flip through newspapers anymore. You scrolled. As they scrolled through the same information, many young Jews, not all, but many young Jews had that, oh my goodness feeling, that peoplehood feeling, that jujitsu, we have to do something. This is an attack not just on Israelis over there, but against us as Jews, as lowercase l liberals, and as Westerners. And not all feminists, I don't want to overstate, but too many feminists caught in a different ideology, refused even to acknowledge not just the Jew hatred, but the women hatred that fed the attack. And so right now, I actually think the possibilities of Zionism are quite inspiring. I think right now, even though the story isn't ended, even though we don't know what's going to happen, we are having in the United States of America, in Israel, in Australia, in the UK, all over the world, our 67 moment, or what I like to call our Herzl moment or move, where we say this is not acceptable. The status quo doesn't work anymore. And we don't want to be defined by history, but we want to define history. We don't want to be defined by anti-Semites. We want to transcend anti-Semitism. And that is a Zionist empowerment move. And so the essential message I want to say today is that it's too easy to fall into despair. And Zionism is a response to despair, a response to historic despair, and a response to the despair of this moment. Now let's go a little bit deeper into it. And let's look at three different challenges to Zionism at this moment, three different challenges to the Jewish world at this moment, three different challenges to Israel at this moment. And then I'm going to make an argument how Zionism, a renewed, deeper, less defensive, less reactive, more affirmative, more celebratory, more proactive Zionism can be a response. So first, it's important for us to see that what happened on October 7th, two very silly debates ended. One, that silly debate about what's worse, left-wing anti-Semitism or right-wing anti-Semitism. All forms of Jew hatred are unacceptable. All forms of bigotry are unacceptable. And in fact, my friends on the left have to stop yelling and screaming about Trumpian anti-Semitism and white supremacist anti-Semitism. They have to start calling out university anti-Semitism, left-wing anti-Semitism. And my friends on the right have to stop yelling and screaming about left-wing or university anti-Semitism and police their own by calling out right-wing anti-Semitism. Similarly, while we see many people holding on to it still, what did we see? This, again, artificial debate. Oh, I really like Jews. It's just Israel I hate. I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm just anti-Zionist. Really collapsed. In Israel, we saw the Jew hatred, the glee they took in imposing so much pain, which, by the way, is the second miracle of the day. The first miracle of the day is Hezbollah not attacking because we mobilized quickly. The second miracle of the day is in their sadism, in their Jew hatred, in their women hatred, in hunting down women and men at the festival, in spending so much time torturing others. The Hamas terrorists got distracted from their main goal. The intelligence reports we now see were that they were supposed to hold on to the Gaza corridor and work their way up toward Tel Aviv and kill tens of thousands along the way. But because of their Jew hatred, because it wasn't just anti-Semitism, it was anti-Semitic anti-Zionism, they got distracted. And I hope that everybody who suffered that day, every survivor's family, can take a little bit of solace in knowing that all the pain they endured slowed down the second miracle. So the third miracle of Israel being saved, Israelis defending Israel, Israelis saving Israel, Zionism being vindicated, could take place. So if in Israel we saw anti-Semitic anti-Zionism, in the US, on campus, throughout the world, we saw a Jew-hating, an anti-Zionism that was filled with Jew hatred, that started with anti-Zionism. Oh, I'm just attacking Israel, but at its base was anti-Semitic. You know, if on October 7th, instead of hearing from 34 Harvard groups so quickly, at Tufts, at Rutgers, at City College, pro-Palestinian forces, if not now, Jewish Voice for Peace, had sat with their pro-Jewish, their pro-Israel friends, had sat with their Israeli friends and said, this is awful. And then the next day protested, or 3 weeks or 4 weeks later, when the bombs started falling and Israel entered into Gaza, protested, then we could say, okay, it's a debate about what Israel does. But the speed with which they were exhilarated, the speed with which they attacked Israel, the speed with which they said, we deserve this, showed that it's not what Israel does, but what Israel is. This is what decolonization looks like? No. This is what anti-Semitism, fueled by anti-Israelism and anti-Zionism, looks like. And look what happened. Because the universities, because the professorate, because too many people didn't put the brakes on it, hatred breeds more hatred. And so if on October 7th, we saw the anti-Semitic motivations behind the lashing out at Israel, by this spring, at Columbia and elsewhere, we saw them simply lashing out in an anti-Semitic way. Hatred unchecked metastasizes. And I'm quoting here from the Columbia students' letter, and they're talking about how this is not just a critique of Israel, but they say that Jews are all inbred, have no culture. Zionists deserve not to live. The demonization of Zionism, it's a cancer to this planet. The Zionist lies more than it breathes. The itting of Zionism, the dehumanization. and then the notion of resisting by any means necessary, and the mass obsession shows a form of Jew hatred. The great Canadian human rights activist Erwin Kotler says that it used to be the Jew who was hated. Now it's the Jewish state. And yes, we also have to challenge, as the Columbia letter did, our Jewish peers who tokenize themselves by claiming to represent real Jewish values and delegitimize our lived experiences of anti-Semitism. And we also have to call out the degree to which so much of this anti-Semitism, so much of this pro-Palestinianism is anti-American. The taking down of the American flag, the burning of the American flag, the attack on American icons. And notice, when 290,000 Jews gathered on the Washington lawn, how many American flags there were, how many American icons there were, how much love there was of democracy, of true liberalism, suggesting that this is a civilizational fight. And you just go, how could it be that old new Israel is guilty of every Western crime? This is cultural imperialism. And it's an attempt to make everything we stand for, Israel, Judaism, Zionism, and democracy, radioactive. And we don't have time for this, but just to kind of get you thinking, and I'll be happy to share the slideshow afterwards. Think of how anti-Zionism fights on so many different fronts. I call it the big black lie because since day one, they've been trying to blacken Israel's reputation. The big red lie is what Daniel Patrick Moynihan called the Zionism as racism resolution because it came from the Soviet Union. And it was an attempt to call Israel a racist state, an apartheid state, a Nazi state. The big black and white lie is first that this is an easy issue of black and white, and second, that this is a racial issue. When it's not a race issue, we have light-skinned Palestinians and dark-skinned Israelis. And it's also not a question of white privilege. By the way, that negates the Mizrahi experience. And the big red, white, and blue, or if you're Canadian, red and white lie, is that this is all about settler colonialism. Israelis are rooted in their land. Israelis are the original Aboriginal people. Israelis are the indigenous people to the land. It doesn't negate Palestinian rights. And I never get into a negation of any other people's rights because I know how painful it is when people negate my rights. And the accusation of genocide, when even if you accept their numbers, 30,000 have been killed, but the Palestinian population has quintupled over Israeli rule and since Israel's existed. And look at the real numbers of genocides and what genocide truly means. It's an unfortunate and very painful war. But it's the pro-Hamas big green lie to call what Israel's doing genocide, especially when we see how many tens of thousands of innocent civilians were killed by the United States, by coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Mosul. The disproportionality, the big lie is unnerving. And notice also the obsession. The United States went into Mosul to save the innocent people of Mosul for 9-10 months, killed over 10,000 innocent civilians, and there were 80 New York Times articles in those 9 months. Since in the first 6 months of the Gaza war, there were 3,600 New York Times articles about it. So there's a media firestorm. And I think it's important, given that there's a media company, that we talk about the role of the media in setting up this, or at least think about it. And what I call the triple double cross. Look, November 30th now, National Organization of Women finally responds sort of to the rapes, but doesn't mention the word Hamas, doesn't mention the word Gaza, doesn't mention Jews, Israelis, the targeting. Why is it the triple double cross? They betrayed the Jews. We're unfortunately used to that. They betrayed core liberal ideas. But most important, they betrayed themselves. They betrayed their fundamental tenets of the feminist movement. And again, it wasn't every feminist. And there have been feminists like Susan Estrich who called them out, but too many. So one issue we have to think about is how do we respond to all this hatred? How do we respond to all these lies? How do we respond to all this anger? The second, because true Zionism doesn't pretend that we have a rose garden, talks about the complexity of today, the complexity of Israel. Even before we got to October 7th, with all its dilemmas, with all its pains. We had political dysfunction, we had political division, we had political polarization. And by the way, not just in Israel, in the American Jewish community too. And we have big, big questions about how do we work together? How do we govern? our society in Israel through laws, and American Jewish society, American Jewish organizations, American Jewish communities in a more informal, voluntaristic way? Big, difficult questions. And the third challenge. So the first challenge is this hatred, this anti-Semitic anti-Zionism, this anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. The second challenge is the political division, the political dysfunction. And the third is what I've been talking about for decades. The fact that so many young Jews, especially, like so many young Westerners, feel lonely, isolated, lost. They experience what Emil Durkheim over 100 years ago called anomie, a feeling of listlessness, of purposelessness, of anonymity, of loss. And even the Surgeon General has warned against it. And I'm arguing that Zionism is a response. But first I say, where do I begin? Zionism is a thrice-born movement. First, in the Bible, we learn about the power of Eretz Yisrael. We learn about, in Lech Lecha, the power of Jewish peoplehood. But we learn about it, it's sort of like the religion and the peoplehood are intertwined. I call this the Oreo cookie, but rooted in the land. And then in the mid-1800s, as other nations form, and then Mordechai Kaplan in the 1900s will give us the phrase peoplehood, we learn about Jewish nationhood and Jewish peoplehood. And then, most formally, in 1897, Theodor Herzl formally launches the movement for Jewish statehood. Now, we have to do a little bit of an exorcism because we've now learned that nationalism is a problematic word. When Donald Trump, I don't care if you love him or hate him, when Donald Trump says, I am a nationalist, say it, during the 2018 midterms campaign, then everybody who hates Donald Trump says, well, I hate Donald Trump, he loves nationalism, I got to stay away from nationalism. Nationalism, we know, is a neutral tool. But notice this goes back to even 2004, one of Barack Obama's ambassadors made a joke about nationalism being like cheap alcohol. Makes you blind and then it kills you. In the 1950s, Isaiah Berlin warned us, don't define nationalism by Nazism, right? Nationalism turned against the Jews in the 1940s was murderous. Nationalism in 1948 lifted us up as Zionism. So he says nationalism can be seen as pathological, but when I talk about the Jewish case, I mean those internal bonds which make us a family, which connect us, keep us together. And one of his students, Yael Tamir, a leftist, saw in 2019 how important it was to articulate the power of nationalism for liberal democracy. Because I, as an American historian, she, as a liberal nationalist, cannot tell the story of healthy democracies without talking about nationalism, the nation state, to pull us out of our self-centered individualism, to give us a sense of what she calls a stable cross-class coalition. Think about it. How do I appeal to a gazillionaire to pay more taxes? I could appeal to his or her better humanity. But a sense of nationalism, a sense of us, mobilizes it. So Zionism means that we are a people, Am Yisrael, tied into a land, Eretz Yisrael, and have the right to establish a state, Medinat Yisrael. And I define it, and I use the word a lot, and I wait until the middle of the lecture to define it, or toward the end of the lecture, because we have to think about what does it mean. So I define it as the movement of Jewish national liberation. Initially, it was to establish a state. Today, it is to defend the state when necessary, but to perfect the state and continue building and rebuilding the state, ourselves, and the world always. And with that in mind, with that lens, we can then see the three challenges and three responses. The challenge of anti-Semitism and of Jew hatred and of bigotry in general calls for what I call a dignity Zionism or renewed liberal Zionism, a social justice Zionism, which doesn't allow them to define us, but pushes back, but also with positive liberal values, retaking the word liberal from them and rejecting the illiberal liberals. And the second piece is toward political dysfunction here and abroad. We have responsibility Zionism, and I'm echoing a phrase that President Yitzhak Herzog used at the Zionist Congress, the 125th anniversary of the Zionist Congress a few years ago. We need to take responsibility. We need to have leaders who apologize when they make mistakes. We need to have leaders who speak not just to the left and not just to the right, but to left and right together. and mobilize what I call the silenced majority. We need to have leaders who understand that it's their job not just to get reelected, not just to mobilize the base. We need leaders who understand that Rav Soloveitchik talked about two covenants, the covenant of fate and the covenant of destiny. The covenant of fate is leaving Mitzrayim, leaving Egypt. We're a camp, a machaneh. We're intertwined. Our nerve endings are intertwined. We experienced that on October 7th. But it's not just to look out for one another, but it's also, what did we learn at Sinai? We have a mission, we have a vision, we have a goal. We are an Edah, not just a machaneh, but an Edah. We have that shared mission. And I add a third pillar, because it's much more stable, which is a covenant of culture. Yerushalayim shel zahav, Jerusalem of gold. We know those songs. Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah. Zionism is not just about politics, not just about ideology. It's also about creating a new culture, a culture that unites us all over the Jewish world, and also, hopefully, as we saw in Eurovision, entertains the world too. This new political Zionism has to be not just about defending Israel, but perfecting it, as I said. And I call this tonal Zionism. My wife, Linda's an artist, and I've learned that you can actually paint an amazing picture. This isn't one of hers. I just took it off the internet. Just by changing tones. We need a change of tone in the Jewish world. We need a change of tone, Nate Geller style. We needed it in Tel Yehuda, and he brought it. We need to have good governance. And by the way, I've not successfully translated that phrase into Hebrew. And we need to understand that we don't have uniformity, but we nevertheless need unity on core issues. And think of the South. I don't care where you stand politically. Learn from the settlers. They took the Shtachim, Yehuda v'Shomron, Judea and Samaria, the occupied territories. I'm not getting into the nomenclature question. They took them and said, this is going to be the platform on which we build our ideals. This is going to be the way in which we express our ideas. And they created communities. Love them or hate it. And so why not, in Israel and abroad, make the South our platform? Make the South, and hopefully eventually the North, the place, the platform on which we rebuild. And I'm proud to say that my son Aviv served on base and throughout the Shtachim, throughout the territories, for 4.5 months during this war, and most recently is down in Kibbutz Be'eri. And look at the anomaly. They're in redone apartments. They're picking clementines during the day, and at night they hang out in front of redone apartments, which nevertheless still have the markings of Zaka and IDF. And if we have a responsibility Zionism, which is part 2, and a dignity Zionism, which is part 1, part 3 is what I've been calling for, and is very much in the spirit of what I worked with Nate Geller in Kibbutz, in Tel Yehuda, is identity Zionism, where we flip the question around. And with all due respect to John Kennedy, we don't just ask what your country can do for you. We ask, what can your country, we don't just ask, what can you do for your country? We ask what your country can do for you. We ask, what does it mean to have a Jewish state? What does it mean to be a part of a Jewish peoplehood? What does it mean? I don't just want a guilt trip. You must defend the Jewish people. I want a Masa. I want a journey. I want a celebration. And I recently read the biography of Justice Scalia. And he tells his kids, as an educator, what his parents told him. You're not everybody else. We have our own standards. We have our own vision. And that's what being an engaged Jew, a religious Jew, a caring Jew like Nate was. And that's what being a Zionist is all about. And I end and open to questions by saying that this is the message that is now seeping into our students and seeping in to the American Jewish community and the Canadian Jewish community. It's not just a story, October 7.2, of the Israelis defending themselves. And by the way, when I speak to students, I point out, I say, you know, when I tell the stories of my kids and their heroism, they have a certain kind of heroism, absolutely. But you have a heroism too, because when my kids come home, they get firgun, and I teach them the Hebrew word firgun, which means attaboy or attaperson, a slap on the shoulder. You're doing great. Where are you serving? Kol hakavod. When you stand up at Columbia University, as over 500 students did this week, and sign this letter saying we proudly believe in the Jewish people's right to self-defense in our historic homeland, and it is a fundamental tenet of our Jewish identity, of our personhood, of who we are. That takes courage because you don't get Firgun. And so I want to end by saying that we're each inspiring one another. We're each working with one another. We're each building one another up. And we've discovered, I think, after October 7th, if we didn't realize it before, that we need one another more than ever. And when I say we, I start with the Jewish people. I start with that amazing, crazy, wonderful Jewish family. But I also include so many of our non-Jewish friends who understand, as I said, that this is not just a fight for Israel. This is not just a fight for the Jewish people. This is a fight for Americanism, for liberalism, for Western civilization, for humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm sure all of us, our minds are going quickly with all of the questions that you've raised, and so I really appreciate the provocative and exciting lecture. A reminder to everyone, send me your questions. I got a few. I think everybody was riveted. And so we have about 20 minutes right now. Send questions, and I'll do my best to work them into the conversation. But I guess my first question to you, Gil, is I think the universal experience of Jews after October 7th is whatever you believed before and whatever you believe now, we all have had moments where we're grappling with our beliefs that have been shaken and realizing these things I thought were true, I might have been wrong about that. And I'm curious if you've had those moments and what you would say you've reconsidered in this moment about all of this.
So as you can see, thanks to Ben Mizrahi, Alav Shalom, my Zionism was reaffirmed. My sense of who our enemies are and who our friends are was reaffirmed. But look at me, I'm a professor. I'm a case of arrested development. I got to the university when I was a freshman and never left. And seeing, even though we've been watching it for decades, even though 23 years ago, during what they called the Second Intifada, I saw how academics could make anything complex. They could go to Starbucks and write 35 papers about why you sit in one corner and that's an anthropological analysis and somebody else always goes with a group, why you're willing to pay $7.50 for a mochaccino and that could be a sociological analysis or an economic analysis. But when it comes to Israel, back then, they said Israel apartheid, Zionism is racism. But as bad as it was then, to see the hooliganism on campus, to see the delight in rape and murder and mayhem, to see hostage posters ripped down, even with my skepticism, I was shocked. And to see anti-Semitism spread in the United States of America, to see the jump in Jew hatred has been shocking. And I not only yell and scream about the radicals, I ask, where's the silenced majority? I grew up in Queens. My neighbors who voted Democratic, this is not a partisan issue, would not have allowed JFK traffic to be blocked during Christmas time. They would not have allowed the White House to be disrespected with red paint. They would not have allowed people to yell and scream outside Sloan Kettering Memorial Institute. They wouldn't have allowed too many people to say, oh, well, they're just expressing themselves. You want to express yourself, fine, but there have to be red lines. And there has to be respect for law and order and for Esmond. I'm a free speech absolutist, and I want a robust debate on campus. And I want a robust debate in the city spheres, but also you have to have red lines. And the failure of our authorities to sometimes enforce those is problematic. But also, I don't hear the anger on the street against this kind of hooliganism, and it's shocking and depressing.
Mm. I also want to ask about the word Zionism. I think you described not letting the anti-Semite define Judaism. We've got to take ownership of that, and obviously you can draw that parallel directly to the word Zionism. At the same time, I think the word has many people using the word are using it as a pejorative, and it may be that outside of Jewish communities that's how it's most understood. I wish I would love data to give me information about that, but I think that's not impossible given the rhetoric of the last 7 months. And then, we also have, for example, your book, like it's not easy, right? This lecture was 40 minutes. The book is really long. It's not easy to define. And I'm curious whether you've given any thought to I guess, to whether the term might have outlived its use and whether there might be room in the world for a new way to describe all of the ideas that you're talking about.
Look, my problem is I'm a New Yorker, and so I don't let the bad guys win. And when the bullies come and they try to define Zionism, I say, I'm not going to let them do that. And it's partially our failure. I admit it's partially our failure as a Jewish community because we allowed them to run the conversation, but also we ran away from the term. So 23 years ago, I wrote this book, Why I'm a Zionist, which is a response I wanted to take back the night. I didn't want them to define us. And I was told by a major Jewish community leader, love the book, happy to write the preface. I asked him to write the preface, but won't touch the word Zionism. And to him, it was a nostalgic term. To him, it was a term of the heavy-duty Jewish agency bureaucracy. To him, it was a term that had outlasted its shelf life. But two things. One is that I learned from my feminist friends to take back the night. I learned from my African-American friends, from my LGBTQ plus friends, not to allow the enemy to define us, the oppressor to define us. And so I refuse to give them that victory they don't deserve. But at the same time, I want us to have a, dare I call it, a rejuvenation, this jujitsu, in which we say, this is what Zionism means. And look at, that's why I thought it was so beautiful what the Columbia students did. They didn't say we're going to run away from the term. They said, we're going to double down and we're going to say, you can't rob me of my joy. You can't rob me of my connection. You can't rob me of my story. And my story is a story where Zionism is the movement first to establish the Jewish state. And I put that in because I acknowledge some people say, oh, well, Zionism ended in 1948. And I say, no. In the same way that Americanism continues to be a framework for America and to try to make America better every day, so too Zionism is the framework first to build us up. We come to the land to build and be rebuilt. So we rebuild ourselves by building that amazing project called Israel and making it better. And that's the Zionist ideal, again, for people outside of Israel and inside as well.
Do you think there's like a cost, though, to centering the idea of Zionism over, I mean, the phrase that continues, some people on this call have heard me say this before, the phrase that continues to stick with me over these last 7 months is from Rabbi Michal Biton, the pain you're feeling is peoplehood, and that peoplehood idea, so I feel sometimes may get drowned out by debate over Zionism. Like, how do you think about those costs and benefits?
So again, going back to October 7th, I think people had a peoplehood feeling. Peoplehood is a feeling. Peoplehood is a sense of belonging. But Zionism is the movement that activates that sense of peoplehood, that puts it into action. And Zionism says, we're not just going to say, oh, Hine Matov Manayim, we sit together, how goodly our tents are, and sway, which is important. We start with that. I start with belonging, but I add two other B's, which is becoming and bettering. And so Zionism is always the movement of activism. Zionism was, and frankly, I've often felt, and this is not a critique of Michal Biton's amazing work, but historically, and also in certain corners of the American Jewish community, especially the American Jewish Studies movement, they use the word peoplehood to kind of distance from statehood. And I'm not going to fall for that trick. So I'm not saying everybody falls for that trick, but I know that there has been an attempt to kind of, oh, well, Zionism is too controversial and the statehood thing is too problematic. I think the genius of Zionism was to say, look, we're going to take all these amazing ideas and all these amazing feelings, and we're going to put it to the true test. It's really easy for me to be holy when I don't have responsibility. It's really easy for me to wag my finger at you and say, you're not doing it right. As we've seen, as we're seeing, and I'm, struggling with some of the issues that the government is struggling with and is failing to struggle with, we see that Zionism is about rolling up your sleeves and making it happen. And so both historically and ideologically on one hand, and also psychologically, I'm just not willing to give up on the term. And I think peoplehood is often a dodge, but that peoplehood feeling is so important. That's the Kishkas feeling. But the action is that Herzl moment, that 1967 moment, that Zionist movement.
We have a lot of questions now about the anti-Zionist, and I want to just flesh that question out a little bit. We have questions about how do we talk to young people who grew up really deeply enmeshed in our Jewish institutions and now identifies as an anti-Zionist. We have questions about a lot of questions in that vein. And I guess what I want to add there is through our reporting, I think that what we have learned at JTA is that the young Jews particularly, but not only young Jews who identify in this way and are participating in this moment in this way, they've thought about it. It's not they've got something to say, and I think a little bit like the settlements movement that you described, love them or hate them, that's a real piece of the Jewish people, and what can we learn? And I guess I'm curious what you would say about what you think we can learn in this moment from the, I think, growing number of Jews who identify and act as anti-Zionist.
So first, let me acknowledge that it's a very painful topic and a complicated topic. I spoke to one young friend who is Zionist, who described what's going on in his family. He said this is like the 1850s and the Civil War. I guess he wanted to translate for me for an American historian. I know that it's a difficult issue, and I'm going to be superficial and glib because we don't have a lot of time. But I just want to acknowledge the complexity of it and the pain. That's number one. Number two is I think it's really important that we, especially in the Jewish community, but also in the broader American polity, listen past the noise. They punch way above their weight, both politically now in the American, broader American community and the American Jewish community. We give them way more attention than they deserve. And I think we need some sophisticated polls looking at how many young people on October 7th had that, what I'm calling that aha peoplehood moment, and ran toward Israel, ran toward Zionism, ran toward activism, and how many ran away. I see a lot of numbers thrown around, but I have not yet seen a study, certainly within the Jewish community, certainly among young Jews, that convinces me. So that's number one. Number two is I've always believed in Pilates, strengthening our core, and in the minyan. We count who shows up. So I think we spend way too much time worrying about the people who are outside and not enough time building up the people from the inside. And that's why I talk about things like identity. That's why I talk about things like anomy. That's why I try to offer useful frameworks that can help our students both in fighting back, but also in celebrating. Because who wants to be on a team that's always under attack? Who wants to be on a team that's always losing? And so part of my vision here, the possibilities of Zionism, is bringing people in who are on the fence to see, wow, this is possible. And part of it also is building a really big tent, right to left. So that my Zionism isn't Netanyahu Zionism, and it's not Meretz Zionism. It's big tent Zionism. Now, the third, to get to the core of your question, I think we need to lean in without falling over. And that's the message that I give to Birthright Madrachim. 4 years ago during COVID, I did a whole series of workshops with Birthright leaders, because the tour guides, because I didn't want the first time they heard, and I'm just going to throw out these words, woke, microaggression, macroaggression, for it to be, because we know Israelis. And if the first time they heard it, it was thrown at them, they might laugh or they might be contemptuous. And one of the things I tried to teach them is to lean in, listen to where it's coming from. One of the things I think we have to realize, and this is, as the older I get, the more I realize it, is that most bad ideas are good ideas that have gone all accelerator, no brakes. So I could take any one of the ideas and any one of, frankly, of the young Jews, and there are also old Jews who are also part of this critique of Israel. And it starts with something really healthy. It starts with something really good. It starts with a positive value, either a concern for Palestinians, a concern for equality, a critique of Haredim, and on and on and on. It starts in a good place. But there's a fanaticism that goes too far. And I think we have to be aware of that. And so I lean in to really hear where it's coming from, but I also have certain red lines. And I think sometimes in the Jewish community, we're too afraid to have those red lines. So I'm sorry when, if not now, and Jewish Voices for Peace go into the Capitol weeks after October 7th, when we're bleeding, when we're reeling, and they take one of the holiest Jewish phrases, Hamakom Yinechem Echem, B'toch Sha'ar of Leit Zion, and instead, may you be comforted with the mourners of Zion, and trade Zionism for Al-Aqsa. They've crossed a red line. They've gone into the holiest vocabulary we have and flipped it in a way that is just more in the realm of Freud and their issues with their parents than about me. And I think it's easy to say that sometimes when you cross those lines, the conversation is over. But most of all, I try to keep the conversation going. I try to learn from them, and I hope they'll learn from me.
So, I would say that in our reporting on college campuses, the main thing we hear from Jews on campus, and we've seen this in some public letters also, is I don't identify with the Jews who are joining the encampments. And I also I don't really want to, wave a flag and get in a fight either. I just want to live my life. And those folks have told us, I don't know who's going to help me do that. Like, where are the leaders to give me a shape for that? And so I guess we have 4 minutes on the clock, and I have 2 questions I want to ask. One of them is, and maybe this is a very a speed round, three-word answer, but what is the one thing that the Jewish people can do for ourselves right now to strengthen that core? What is that? What is the thing we can actually do? I hear about what the ideas that we should, how we should feel, or what ideas we should be drawn to, but what is the action?
Celebrate and act. The more Jews stand up for themselves on college campuses, the more Jews give to Israel, the more Jews come to Israel, the more Jews feel like they're a part of the story rather than apart from the story. They go from passivity to and despair to action and inspiration. That's the Zionist jujitsu. That's what happened in 1948. That's what happened in 1967, and that's what has to happen today.
And the answer to this question might be the same. And then I wish we could go on forever, but I want to be respectful of everyone, and we can obviously keep talking. You mentioned, you described responsibility Zionism and alluded to problems of leadership. And I think many Israelis, we know, feel that the leadership is not the leadership the country needs. Certainly many American Jews do not identify with the leadership currently in place in Israel. And just as, there's pressure to have a day after the war vision for governance in Gaza, I'm curious what your vision is do you have a vision, I guess, for day after Zionism? At some point, we'll move out of this crisis moment and into a place where we can look forward further into the future. And what would day after Zionism look like?
So first, let's remember what patriotism means. Patriotism means loving your country because of its politicians sometimes, and despite its politics always. I don't change my love for America whether Donald Trump or Joe Biden is president or is elected or reelected. My love of America, my love of Israel is not conditional. It's unconditional, and that's what makes me an effective activist. And so as someone who called for Bibi Netanyahu to resign 7 years ago, and yet still ardently defends Israel, I can live with those two contradictions because that's what being a lowercase d Democrat is all about. So I think we're actually living in 3 time zones. We're living in today, where we must win the war, and the war in the United States of America and Canada and elsewhere, as well as the war in Israel. Zero tolerance and grow a spine. It's time to fight. There are times to celebrate. There are times to laugh. It's time to fight. That's part 1. Part 2, the day after. You're absolutely right. The fact that we're not using all our creativity, all our startup nation thoughts to figure out A, how to make Israeli politics better, but B, how to make the situation in Gaza better, how to think about a day after, is a stunning, inexcusable failure. I don't want Joe Biden or Anthony Blinken running the peace train. I want us running the peace train as a Zionist. I want us thinking about the day after, and I want us bombarding people with all kinds of creative ideas and having robust debate. But finally, what did Bill Clinton sing in 1992? Don't stop thinking about tomorrow. While doing that, while in the muck of the fight, while trying to be creative, we also have to keep on envisioning what kind of Jewish community do we want to live in? What kind of Israel do we want to live in? What kind of world do we want to live in? And that's what I learned from my friend Nate Geller. That's what I learned person by person, chanich by chanich, from his amazing wife, Lynn. I learned that you can heal, you can help, you can teach us old fogies and tell Yehuda, who never thought of a camp social worker, that you need indeed a social work staff. And I learned from all my Zionist teachers and all my Zionist leaders and from my father that ideas can lift us up, ideas count, and Zionism does indeed work as one of those effective ideas. Not perfect, but always being perfected and perfecting the world.
Perfect, beautiful ending. Thank you so much, Gil, for being here, for your thoughts, for this conversation. And I just want to thank everyone who joined today for your smart questions, which we will continue to answer as always through our reporting at JTA. And thank you, of course, to the Gellers and to Nate's example for bringing us all together to have this conversation.
Yehי Zachro Baruch.